Imagine standing on a hillside outside Vienna in the last hours before dawn on a September morning in 1683. The air is cool, carrying the smell of smoke and horses and something else, something harder to name. Below you, stretching across the plain, are the tents and earthworks of an Ottoman army that has been pressing against the walls of the city for nearly 2 months. Beyond those walls, the defenders are exhausted, running low on food, running low on hope. They've held on through summer, but everyone understands that summer is ending, and somewhere in the darkness of that hillside, tens of thousands of soldiers are waiting for enough light to see by, waiting for the signal that will launch one of the most consequential cavalry charges in the history of warfare. This is where the story ends. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, why it stopped something that had been moving for centuries with the momentum of a tide, you have to go back, a long way back. Because what was pressing against the walls of Vienna in 1683 wasn't just an army. It was the accumulated force of an empire that had grown from a small frontier state in northwestern Anatolia into something that covered territory, stretching from the deserts of Algeria in the west to the plains of Iraq in the east, from the Hungarian grasslands in the north to the mountains of Yemen in the south. An empire that had absorbed one of the most famous cities in the ancient world, that had broken the old order of the Eastern Mediterranean, that had been a serious and sometimes dominant military and political force in European affairs for 200 years. How does something like that get built? And how does it get stopped? Not gradually, not by slow erosion, but on a single September afternoon, on a hillside outside a city in Central Europe. That's the question at the centre of tonight's story. And it's one of those historical questions where the answer refuses to be simple. The charge itself took maybe 20 minutes. The road to that charge took centuries. We'll follow both, from the earliest days of a state that most people at the time barely noticed, through the machinery of conquest and administration that turned a frontier beylik into a world power, through the long rivalry with Christian Europe that produced crusades and counterattacks, and a grinding, lurching advance that brought Ottoman armies to the gates of Vienna not once but twice. And then to that pre-dawn hillside, and what happened when the light finally came. The story has the texture of something almost inevitable in retrospect, the kind of history that seems to have been building toward a single dramatic moment. But history is rarely as clean as that. There are a dozen points along the way where different decisions, different weather, different commanders might have produced a different outcome. That's worth holding on to. The drama is real, but so is the contingency. If you're watching this to drift off to sleep, you're exactly who I had in mind when I put this together. Long-form historical storytelling at a pace that lets you actually absorb it, or just float along on the surface of it until your eyes close. I'm glad you're here, and I'd genuinely love to know where you are right now, and what time it is where you are. There's something I find endlessly interesting about people all over the world, in different time zones, at different hours of the night or early morning, all following the same thread back through the same history. Drop it in the comments. I always read them. But for now, let's go back to the beginning. Before the siege, before the empire, before anyone could have guessed what was coming. In the late 13th century, the landscape of northwestern Anatolia was fragmented in a way that's hard to picture from the vantage point of knowing what came next. The old Seljuk Sultanate that had dominated much of Anatolia was crumbling under the pressure of Mongol invasions from the east. Byzantine power, which had once stretched across the whole of the region, had contracted into something much smaller and more fragile. And into that space, along the edges, on the margins between what remained of these older powers, a collection of small Turkish principalities had taken root. They were called beyliks, frontier lordships, and there were perhaps a dozen of them, each carved out by a different leader, each pressing against the weakening Byzantine borderlands in its own way. One of these was controlled by a man named Osman. His territory was small, poorly documented, and in the early years probably indistinguishable from the others around it. He ruled from around 1299, though that date is more conventional than certain. The sources for his life are thin, and the later Ottoman tradition had every reason to mythologize its founder. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Osman's beylik occupied a particularly useful piece of geography. It sat close to Byzantine territory, which meant regular opportunities for raiding and for attracting Muslim warriors who wanted to fight on the frontier for religion and for profit. It was far enough from the Mongol centres of power that it wasn't constantly threatened from the east, and it happened to border some of the most contested ground in the region. That geography wasn't destiny, but it was an advantage that Osman and his successors knew how to use. Raiding was the engine of early Ottoman growth in a very practical sense. Successful raids brought plunder, which attracted more fighters, which enabled more raids, which produced more plunder. There was a momentum to this that self-reinforced, and the warriors who came to join the frontier enterprise weren't all Turks or even all Muslims. The early Ottoman state was notably flexible about who it absorbed and how. Byzantine nobles who converted or simply submitted could find a place in the emerging structure. Local Christian populations were often taxed and administered rather than displaced. Alliances were made, broken, and remade, according to what was useful at the time. The later image of the Ottomans as a rigidly Islamic imperial power doesn't quite fit these early decades. The early state was pragmatic in a way that was almost opportunistic, and that flexibility was a genuine source of strength. Osman's son Orhan continued the expansion, and under Orhan something important happened. The enterprise began to look less like a raiding enterprise and more like a state. Administrative structures developed. Coins were struck in Orhan's name. The capture of Bursa in 1326 gave the Ottomans a proper city, a base that was something more than a military camp. These are the kinds of details that, individually, might not seem dramatic, but together they mark the transition from a warband operating on the margins to a durable political entity with the infrastructure to sustain itself across generations. The Byzantine Empire, watching all of this from Constantinople, was not passive, but it was crippled by internal conflict in ways that made coherent resistance nearly impossible. Rival claimants to the Byzantine throne were actually hiring Ottoman troops as mercenaries, paying the very people who were gradually encircling them to help settle dynastic disputes. It's the kind of arrangement that looks obviously short-sighted in retrospect, and probably looked questionable to some observers at the time, but when you're fighting a civil war, the immediate threat tends to crowd out the longer-term one, and then came the crossing into Europe. Around 1352 or 1354, depending on which sources you credit and how you interpret them, Ottoman forces crossed the Dardanelles and established a foothold in Thrace. This is one of those genuinely pivotal moments in the history of the region. The move into Europe wasn't, as far as we can tell, a grand strategic vision executed according to plan. It seems to have begun opportunistically, an invitation to assist in yet another Byzantine internal conflict, a footing gained, and then the recognition that the footing was worth keeping. Gallipoli, on the European shore, became the first significant Ottoman base in Europe, and from there the expansion into the Balkans began. The Balkans in the mid-14th century were not a unified Christian resistance waiting to repel an invasion. They were almost as fragmented as Anatolia had been. The Bulgarian and Serbian kingdoms were at various stages of strength and decline. Local lords pursued their own interests. The Byzantine Empire was reduced to Constantinople and a few other scattered territories. There was no single power capable of mounting sustained coordinated opposition, and so the Ottoman advance moved forward, not in a single dramatic sweep, but in a succession of campaigns, negotiations, tributaries accepted, alliances formed, territories absorbed. The Battle of Maritsa in 1371 and the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 are the names that appear most often in discussions of this period, and both were significant. But they were significant as episodes in a longer process rather than as single decisive turning points. The Ottomans were building something in the Balkans that was genuinely complex, a system of governance that incorporated local elites where possible, extracted resources, maintained order up to a point, and continued to expand. Christian nobles in the Balkans sometimes served as vassals. Sometimes they fought alongside Ottoman armies against other Christian powers. The picture is considerably messier than the clean narrative of Christian Europe versus Ottoman Islam that gets written later with the benefit of hindsight and the distorting lens of religious politics. What made the Ottoman state durable in those early centuries wasn't simply military force, though military force clearly mattered. It was the capacity to absorb, to take what worked from the institutions of the people it conquered, whether Byzantine administrative practices or the expertise of converted nobles or the fighting traditions of steppe cavalry, and fold them into something that functioned. Flexibility, again. The willingness to be pragmatic rather than ideologically rigid about how the enterprise was organized. By the end of the 14th century, what had begun as one small frontier principality among a dozen was something qualitatively different. It controlled significant territories on 2 continents. It had a capital, initially Bursa and then Edirne in Europe itself, which is its own kind of statement about where Ottoman power was focused. It had institutions that could survive the death of individual rulers, which is the real test of whether something is a state rather than just a personality. And it had developed the military capacity and the administrative reach to keep expanding. None of this was inevitable. There were moments of serious crisis, including a catastrophic defeat at the hands of Timur in 1402 that fractured the Ottoman state for a decade and nearly ended the experiment entirely. But it didn't end. The recovery from that near collapse is itself remarkable and may be underappreciated. This state reassembled itself, resumed expansion, and eventually did what had seemed almost unimaginable to the world that had built it. But that comes later. For now, what matters is this. The thing that would eventually press against the walls of Vienna started here, in a contested borderland, with a leader whose territory was small enough that most of his contemporaries probably didn't think twice about him. History has a way of being quietly building towards something for a very long time before the thing becomes visible. Understanding how the Ottomans kept what they took is, in some ways, a more interesting question than how they took it in the first place. Military conquest is dramatic. It has a shape you can follow, a moment of decision, a battle won or lost, a city fallen. Administration is quieter and less visible, but it's what transforms a battlefield victory into something that lasts a generation or 5 centuries. The Timur system was central to this. When Ottoman forces moved through new territory, the land wasn't simply divided among whoever had fought for it in some informal arrangement. It was surveyed, assessed, and redistributed through a structure that tied military service to agricultural revenue in a carefully calculated way. A soldier, typically a cavalryman called a sipahi, was granted the right to collect taxes from a piece of land, not to own it outright in any permanent hereditary sense, but to draw income from it in exchange for showing up for campaigns fully equipped. The land ultimately belonged to the Sultan. The sipahi was, in a meaningful way, a kind of tax farmer with a horse and a spear. When he died, the arrangement didn't automatically pass to his son. It returned to the state to be reassigned. This kept power from crystallizing too solidly in any single family's hands, at least in theory, and it gave the central government a lever to pull whenever provincial loyalty needed reinforcing or correcting. Provincial governance built on this foundation. The empire was divided into units, eyalets, and later smaller sanjaks, administered by officials appointed from the centre and answerable to it. These governors had real local authority, real power over taxation and order and justice within their jurisdictions, but they were rotated, moved, replaced. Roots were not encouraged. A governor who spent 15 years in one province and built up personal networks and local loyalties was a potential problem. A governor who spent 3 years there and then moved somewhere else remained a representative of the Sultan rather than a power in his own right. The system was designed, at its best, to keep the provinces legible to the centre, to prevent the kind of feudal fragmentation that had weakened so many of the polities the Ottomans had absorbed. Then there were the Janissaries, and they deserve a moment's attention because they genuinely impressed and alarmed the people who encountered them. The Janissaries were infantry, which already set them apart in a military world that often treated cavalry as the prestige arm of any army. They were disciplined, trained intensively, armed with firearms earlier and more systematically than most of their European contemporaries. By the 15th century they were organised along lines that would not have looked entirely out of place to a modern observer. Professional soldiers with pay, hierarchy, barracks, a distinct institutional identity. The great European powers were still fielding armies that were, in significant part, feudal levies and mercenary contingents assembled and dissolved season by season. The Janissaries were something different, something more permanent. They came from a system called devshirme, a periodic levy of boys from Christian communities in the Balkans and elsewhere, taken young, converted to Islam, educated and trained for service to the Ottoman state. It was a practice that raises obvious ethical questions from any modern vantage point, and it was experienced as a loss and a grief by the communities it drew from. But it also, over time, produced men who rose to extraordinary positions of power. Grand viziers came from the devshirme. Military commanders of the highest rank came from it. The system created a cadre of officials and soldiers whose advancement depended entirely on the Sultan and the Ottoman structure, rather than on family connections or inherited local power. That dependency, paradoxically, could be a source of loyalty and capability rather than resentment, though it also eventually became a source of dysfunction as the Janissaries evolved into a political force in their own right, capable of making and breaking sultans, but that comes later. What's worth noting now is how this military innovation connected to everything else. Guns required gunpowder, which required supply chains, which required money, which required functioning tax collection, which required roads and record-keeping and all the unglamorous infrastructure that military historians sometimes skip past in favour of the battles. The Ottomans were, in this period, remarkably competent logisticians. Moving an army from Anatolia to the gates of Vienna, which would eventually happen, is not primarily a military achievement. It is a supply achievement. Getting food, ammunition, horses, equipment, and tens of thousands of human beings across mountain ranges and river crossings over hundreds of miles, in roughly the right condition to fight at the end of it, is a problem of organisation. The empire invested in roads, in depots, in the administrative capacity to coordinate that kind of movement. The battlefield was where the investment paid off, but the investment itself happened long before. The empire managed all of this across a population of staggering diversity. Greeks and Armenians, Jews expelled from Spain and welcomed into Ottoman cities, Arab populations in the newly absorbed Arab lands, Slavic communities in the Balkans, various Christian sects whose theological differences had caused centuries of conflict within Christendom, and who found, sometimes, a more reliable peace under Ottoman governance than under their co-religionists. The millet system, or something like it, organised religious communities as semi-autonomous groups responsible for their own internal legal and religious affairs, answerable to their own communal leaders, taxed at their own rates. It was not equality in any modern sense, and it was not without friction, coercion, and periodic violence. But it was a pragmatic framework for governing the ungovernable, and for much of the empire's expansion, it worked well enough that the alternatives looked worse. The machinery of expansion, in other words, was not only military, it was administrative, fiscal, logistical, and organisational. A machine, though, still needs fuel, and the fuel was territory, which is why the expansion didn't stop. By the middle of the 16th century, if you could somehow rise high enough above the earth to see by moonlight, you would have noticed something striking about the map. From the Atlantic edge of North Africa, where waves broke against the harbours of Algiers, across the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, over the deserts of Syria, past the green ribbon of the Tigris and Euphrates, through the mountains of Anatolia, and down into the river valleys and plains of the Balkans, there was one continuous zone where coins bore the same ruler's name, where official correspondence moved in the same chancery script, where judgments were issued in the Sultan's authority. It was not seamless. No empire ever is. But for a long stretch of coast and continent from Algeria to Iraq and up into southeastern Europe, you were in Ottoman territory. Later, historians like to draw hard borders around this, carefully tracing lines to show the empire at its absolute maximum. But for the people who lived inside it, what mattered was something more fluid. You could, for example, start in Cairo, the old Mamluk capital on the Nile, following a caravan northward. The merchants with you might speak Arabic, Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Ladino. They haggled in many tongues, but when they paid customs, the receipts bore the same tugra, the stylized calligraphic emblem of the Sultan. Weeks later, after skirting the Sinai and pushing along the old caravan routes through the Levant, you would reach Damascus, Dimashq, green and cool after the dust and heat. The city had been a prize of caliphs and conquerors for more than 1,000 years before the Ottomans arrived, but now its mosques recited the Friday sermon in the name of Suleiman, the lawgiver, the magnificent. Keep going. East, across the Euphrates, toward Mesopotamia. Baghdad, which had once been the glittering centre of the Abbasid world, lay diminished by centuries of invasion and internal strife, but it still commanded the meeting point of rivers and roads. When the Ottomans wrested it definitively from their Safavid rivals, they were not simply taking a city. They were anchoring their rule in the heartland of an older Islamic civilization and asserting a claim over the routes that threaded down toward the Persian Gulf and up toward Anatolia. Or you could move in a completely different direction. From Istanbul you might board a galley and sail west into the Adriatic, your route protected, most of the time, by Ottoman naval squadrons. Harbours along the Aegean Islands, the western Greek coast and further up toward the Dalmatian shore would show the same administrative fingerprints, garrisons drawing pay from the same treasury, tax registers written on the same forms, governors appointed by the same imperial hand. One reason later memory treats the reign of Suleiman as a golden age is that it's during his long rule, from 1520 to 1566, that this vastness feels most coherent, most confidently managed. The empire had been built by his ancestors. He inherited a structure already impressive, but he presided over the moment when its logic seemed to snap into focus. Under him, the Ottomans stood at the intersection of three worlds at once: European, Mediterranean and Islamic. In European chronicles he looms as a threatening figure, battering at Vienna, contesting with Habsburg emperors. In Arabic sources he appears as a patron and protector, the sovereign who now controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the guardian of pilgrimage routes that tied together Muslims from West Africa to Central Asia. In internal Ottoman memory he is Kanuni, the lawgiver, the sultan under whom imperial law codes were compiled and refined, who balanced religious law with sultanic decrees in a way later jurists remembered as an ideal. Cairo became one of the empire's main hinges. It linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and through the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Spices coming from the east, textiles and silver flowing from the west, pilgrims moving toward Mecca, scholars and scribes travelling between centres of learning. Cairo sat in the midst of those currents. Ottoman control here was not about planting flags on a map, so much as inserting themselves into the toll booths of global trade and devotion. Damascus played a different but complementary role. Its orchards and gardens fed the region, but its strategic value lay in its position on the great overland roads. One of the main Hajj caravans, the Damson caravan, formed here each year. Thousands of pilgrims, backed by state subsidies and guarded by troops, moved in a seasonal pulse across the desert to Mecca. For the empire, ensuring their safety was both a logistical challenge and a source of political legitimacy. A ruler who could not protect the pilgrimage risked losing moral authority in the broader Muslim world. Further east, Baghdad functioned as a frontier capital and listening post. On its eastern horizon stood the Safavid state in Iran, a rival with a different religious orientation, different court culture, different ambitions. The border between them was a zone of chronic tension, raids, proxy conflicts, shifting alliances with local tribal powers. Baghdad anchored the Ottoman side of that frontier. It also allowed the Sultan's officials to tap into the commerce moving along the Tigris and Euphrates, down toward Basra and the Gulf, where Portuguese and other European ships were beginning to probe and pry open older trade systems. And on the empire's western edge, Algiers served as both outpost and spear. From there, Ottoman-backed corsairs ranged across the western Mediterranean, preying on Christian shipping, harassing Spanish coasts, and occasionally ferrying troops to support local allies. To the Ottoman centre, the North African eyalets, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, were partly about prestige and ideology, a Muslim counterweight to Christian Spain's push across the sea, and partly about strategic depth. Control of those ports complicated any European attempt to unify the Mediterranean against them. All of this together meant that the Ottomans, at their height, controlled not just territory, but critical corridors. Overland trade from Central Europe and the Black Sea down to the Mediterranean often passed through their domains. Caravans from Iran, India and beyond moved under their watchful eyes. The main routes of the Hajj ran through their provinces, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Red Sea. Much of the Adriatic, these were, for long stretches, effectively Ottoman lakes, patrolled by Ottoman fleets or their clients. In Istanbul, this translated into splendour that visitors found difficult to describe without lapsing into superlatives. A capital straddling two continents, crowned by palaces and mosques, whose domes seemed to float on air. Markets overflowing with silks, coffee, spices, sugar, furs. A court culture that combined steppe traditions with Byzantine ceremony and Persianate aesthetics. European envoys wrote home about processions that seemed endless, about halls lined with tiles and carpets, about jewels and fabrics they struggled even to name. But power that looks effortless from a distance is rarely effortless up close. Even at its most imposing, the empire was dealing with constant pressure. The Habsburgs on one front, the Safavids on another, rebellious governors testing how far they could bend their orders before they broke, banditry along the roads whenever the state's hand slackened, local notables in distant provinces quietly turning tax farms into miniature personal fiefdoms whenever oversight faltered. Economically, the empire sat in the path of global changes it did not initiate. As Portuguese and later Dutch and English ships pushed around the Cape and into the Indian Ocean, some of the old Red Sea and Levantine routes began to lose relative importance. Silver from the Americas flooded into the Mediterranean economy, warping prices, destabilizing traditional tax structures. In the countryside, peasants faced the eternal precariousness of agrarian life. A late frost, a locust swarm, or a badly timed war could mean famine. Administratively, the very mechanisms that had allowed the empire to grow, timars, rotating governors, janissary corps, required constant adjustment. Miscalibration in any one of them could generate trouble. A governor who was moved too quickly might have little incentive to care for his province. One who stayed too long might become a little king. Janissaries who were too indulged could turn from soldiers into kingmakers. Those who were pushed too hard could revolt. So when later chroniclers call Suleiman's age a golden one, they're capturing something real and also simplifying. There was grandeur, stability by the standards of the time, a sense among many elites that they were living in a world whose rhythms made sense. The state could project military force from Hungary to Yemen, from the gates of Fez to the outskirts of Tabriz. It could build monumental architecture, finance caravanserais and bridges and aqueducts, regulate weights and measures in markets from Sarajevo to Aleppo. But the gold, even then, was laid thinly over an iron frame under strain. The same imperial roads that allowed armies and merchants to move efficiently also allowed rumours, dissent and disease to travel quickly. The same seas that the Ottoman fleets patrolled were being quietly rerouted around by Atlantic powers. The same cities that shone brightest, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, Algiers, Istanbul itself, were, by virtue of their importance, the places where any crack in the system would be felt first. From the vantage point of a later century, when we look back and see the siege that will bring Polish horsemen crashing down toward an Ottoman camp, it is easy to imagine an empire already doomed. But at its height, the picture was more complex. This was not a structure teetering on the edge so much as a vast organism constantly adapting, constantly negotiating, constantly managing its own growing pains. And it was from this position of confident, if not effortless, power that the Ottomans turned their attention ever more deeply into Central Europe, toward a frontier that had always tempted them and would eventually test them in ways no previous campaign quite had. If you shift your view from Istanbul and the Mediterranean world and let your imagination drift north and west, the landscape changes. The tidy sense of Ottoman authority that stretched from Algiers to Baghdad begins to fray into something more jagged. Instead of seas and great caravan routes, you find long river valleys, marshes, thick forests and flat wind-swept plains that seem to invite armies to roll over them. At the centre of this zone lies a kingdom that, for centuries, had been powerful in its own right. Hungary. On a map it looks like a basin. The Carpathian Mountains curve around it like a rough horseshoe. Inside that ring is the Great Hungarian Plain, watered by the Danube and its tributaries, an expanse of farmland, pasture and open country. To the south, the Ottoman Balkans. To the west and north, Habsburg lands. To the east, a tangle of smaller powers and principalities. For the Ottomans, looking up from the Balkans, Hungary was both gateway and buffer. If they could dominate that basin, they could push the line of their influence right up against the heartlands of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg dynasty. If they failed, they would face a strong Christian kingdom on their northern frontier, one that could ally with Vienna and Rome and turn the Danube into a barrier instead of a highway. For the Habsburgs, looking down from Vienna, the picture reversed. As long as Hungary remained independent and strong, it blunted Ottoman pressure. If Hungary fell, the Danube Valley would turn into a corridor pointing like an arrow at their capital. The Danube is one of those rivers that quietly organizes whole regions. Rising in the Black Forest, it curves across Central Europe and eventually spills into the Black Sea. In the 16th century, it was both road and moat. Boats could move soldiers, grain, artillery, but the river also formed natural lines of defense, places to build bridges and, more importantly, to fortify them. So when people later talk about the Ottoman-Habsburg struggle, what they're really describing is a contest to control not just individual cities, but this entire river system and the Hungarian basin around it. Whoever set the terms along this frontier would decide how far Ottoman power could extend into Europe and how far Habsburg influence could push back into the Balkans. The fragile equilibrium snapped in 1526, on a late August day near the town of Mohacs. The young king of Hungary, Louis II, rode out with his nobles and levies to meet an Ottoman army, led personally by Suleiman. The Hungarians had a proud martial tradition. They had fought Mongols, Venetians, Habsburgs and earlier Ottoman raids, but Mohacs brought them face to face with a fully mobilized imperial force, seasoned infantry, cavalry, artillery, all integrated into a system that had been tested for decades. The battle itself did not last long. Contemporary accounts, written with different political agendas and anxieties, disagree on details, but the broad outline is stark. Hungarian cavalry charges shattered against disciplined Ottoman firepower. The royal army dissolved into chaos. In the retreat, the 20-year-old king drowned or was crushed in a marshy streambed. When the fighting stopped, a kingdom stopped with it. The physical losses of Mohacs were terrible. Nobles dead, soldiers scattered, churchmen and officials captured. But its political shock was worse. Without a living king, Hungarian elites split. One faction invited the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand, brother of the late Emperor Charles V, to claim the throne through dynastic ties. Another rallied around a local magnate, János Szápolyai, and in time looked to the Ottomans for support. For Suleiman, this was an opening. He had smashed the Hungarian field army. He could not simply convert all of Hungary into an ordinary Ottoman province overnight. The distance from Istanbul, the complexity of local law and landholding, and the presence of rival claimants made that unrealistic. But he could do something subtler and in some ways more enduring. Over the next decades, Hungary did not vanish. It fractured. The central plain, including the old royal capital of Buda, fell under direct Ottoman administration. Mosques rose where churches had stood. Garrisons drew pay from Istanbul. Taxes were registered in Ottoman ledgers. This became Ottoman Hungary, a belt of territory that plugged directly into the imperial system. To the west and north, the Habsburgs consolidated control over what came to be called Royal Hungary, ruling from Bratislava, then Pressburg, claiming to be the rightful heirs of the Hungarian crown, presenting themselves as defenders of Christendom against the Turk. To the east, in Transylvania, a principality emerged that walked a tightrope. Its princes paid tribute to the Sultan, sent gifts, and pledged obedience. But they also negotiated with Vienna and other Christian powers. At different moments they leaned one way or the other, adjusting to pressures and opportunities. From the air, if you could see such things, you would not see a clean frontier line. You would see a ragged belt of fortresses and market towns, tax district and church lands, where loyalties and obligations overlapped. Villages might owe military service to a local noble who recognized the Habsburg king, but also pay certain taxes to an Ottoman official who held a nearby stronghold. Towns might host agents of multiple powers, each collecting their due, each claiming supremacy. This is what a contested borderland looks like. Not iron curtains and towering walls, but a world of double allegiances, of pragmatic accommodations. Local lords might hedge their bets, announcing loyalty to whichever side seemed stronger that year. Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, and Jewish communities lived in close proximity. Their fates tied less to slogans about holy war and more to the tax rates imposed and the behaviour of garrisons nearby. Fortresses became the punctuation marks of this frontier. Imagine travelling up the Danube or across the plain in the mid-16th century. Every so often you would see a hill crowned with earthworks and stone, artillery bastions angled outward, towers thick enough to absorb cannon fire. Names like Esztergom, Komárhom, Győr, Szigetvár, Eger. To later generations, some of these would acquire a halo of legend, the sites of heroic last stands or miraculous defences. But at the time, they were also workplaces, where soldiers drew salaries, craftsmen repaired guns, Scribes drafted lists of grain deliveries and gunpowder stocks. The Ottomans did not simply march forward and hold everything by force of arms alone. They preferred, where possible, to turn defeated rulers into tributaries. A prince or voivode might keep his lands, collect his taxes, and be addressed with honorifics so long as he sent a yearly payment to Istanbul, pledged not to harbour enemies, and perhaps allowed an Ottoman garrison into a key fortress. From the Sultan's perspective, this was efficient. It extended influence without demanding full administrative overhaul. The Habsburgs, for their part, played a similar game in reverse. They made alliances with Croatian nobles along the southern marches, with Transylvanian princes, with various border captains who might not always be fully obedient to Istanbul. They built and rebuilt chains of fortifications, hoping to create a defensive belt that would absorb Ottoman pressure before it reached the Austrian heartland. Between these two great houses, the people of the frontier lived in a state of chronic low-level war. Raids, counter-raids, small sieges, skirmishes. The word border here meant not a clear line, but a zone of mutual exhaustion and constant alert. In 1529, only 3 years after Mohacs, Suleiman pushed this logic to its dramatic edge. That year he marched not just to punish a disobedient vassal, or to secure another stretch of the plain, but to make a statement. His forces advanced up the Danube, taking advantage of river transport and the disarray in Hungary, and he led them toward the Habsburg capital itself, Vienna. The siege that followed has been retold many times in European memory as a pivotal moment, the Turk at the gates. In raw military terms it was serious but not yet decisive. The Ottoman army had marched far in difficult weather. Supply lines stretched thin. Heavy artillery, essential for battering early modern walls, moved slowly and bogged down. Autumn rains turned roads to mud. The defenders had had time to strengthen bastions and stock provisions. After weeks of assaults, sapping, and counterattacks, with winter looming and disease and attrition mounting, Suleiman lifted the siege and withdrew. The city had held. Vienna did not fall. In that sense, the campaign was a failure, but it mattered symbolically in ways that reached far beyond its immediate tactics. For European observers, especially in the Habsburg lands and among Catholic chroniclers, 1529 fixed the Ottomans in the imagination as an existential threat. The idea that an Islamic empire whose authority stretched from North Africa to Mesopotamia could place its banners within sight of the walls of a major Central European capital was deeply unsettling. Sermons and pamphlets framed it as a test of faith, a confrontation between Christendom and the infidel. For the Ottomans, the message was more pragmatic but no less charged. They had demonstrated that they could, when conditions allowed, project power to the very edge of the Habsburg core. Even without capturing Vienna, they showed that they could force the Habsburgs to divert resources, fortify, and negotiate. After 1529, however, nothing resolved neatly. There was no single climactic battle that ended the contest. Instead, Central Europe settled into a kind of long-distance wrestling match. Campaign followed campaign. Some years the Ottomans gained a fortress, some years they lost one. Zigetvar burned with both sides blooded. Eger held out under improbable odds. Treaties were signed, then broken or reinterpreted. Tribute arrangements were adjusted. New alliances formed as Protestant and Catholic states in the empire sometimes weighed their hatred of each other against their fear of Istanbul. Seen from a later century, when the 1683 siege and the Polish charge take centre stage, it is tempting to turn this whole history into a simplified saga. Islam versus Christianity, East versus West. The lived reality was messier. Central Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was a theatre of endurance. Two great dynasties, each with its own internal troubles and rivalries, pressed against each other through a belt of lands that did not fully belong to either. Local actors navigated between them, sometimes invoking religion, more often thinking about survival, taxation, and autonomy. The Danube frontier was not a wall, it was a breathing, shifting contact zone. By the time the Ottomans came back to Vienna a century and a half later, with Polish horsemen waiting in the wings, they were not beginning a new conflict. They were entering the latest and in some ways most desperate round of a struggle that had been grinding on since Mohács, since the day a Hungarian king vanished into a marsh and a kingdom shattered into pieces. If you linger for a moment in that long corridor of fortresses and river bends, you might be tempted to imagine the story as a stalemate. Two empires locked in a frozen arm wrestling match, neither really changing, just shoving back and forth along the same frontier. But time does not stand still, even for empires. If you let the years start to slide past more quickly, 1560, 1580, 1620, 1650, you begin to notice that the world pressing in on the Ottoman Empire is not quite the same one that Suleiman inherited. Inside the empire itself, strain accumulates in places that are not obvious on a battlefield. The Ottoman system had grown up on conquest. New provinces meant new tax revenues, new fiefs to grant to cavalrymen, new stipends for janissaries, new opportunities for grandees at court to skim a little extra. Victories along frontiers in Hungary, in the Red Sea, against the Safavids, fed the machine. By the later 16th century that rhythm started to falter. There were still campaigns, still triumphs, but easily conquered rich lands were harder to come by. Wars dragged on without clear resolution. Administrators had to squeeze more out of existing provinces to pay soldiers who expected regular cash wages instead of old-style land grants. The cost of gunpowder, artillery and fortifications kept rising. Inflation, fueled in part by silver flooding into Europe from the Americas and eventually leaking into Ottoman markets, made the coins in a soldier's pay pouch worth less each year. For ordinary villagers in Anatolia or the Balkans, this did not appear as an abstract fiscal crisis. It showed up as tax farmers pushing harder, as extra levies to rebuild a fortress or supply a distant campaign, as officials looking the other way while local strongmen took their cut. It showed up when a young man who might once have hoped for a cavalry fief found that those opportunities were shrinking, and instead drifted into the growing pool of landless armed men willing to sell their services to whoever promised them plunder. At the same time, the military world around the empire was shifting. Ottoman armies had been early masters of gunpowder. Their field artillery and disciplined janissary infantry with matchlock guns had helped break Mamluk cavalry in the early 1500s and Hungarian knights at Mohács. But gunpowder warfare did not stand still either. Fortification design changed, with lower, thicker bastions that swallowed cannon fire. European enemies poured money into standing armies, drilling infantry to fire in coordinated volleys, experimenting with new tactics and line formations. Ottoman commanders adapted. They modernized some units, bought new types of cannon, refined their own siege techniques. In certain theatres they continued to perform impressively. Yet adaptation cost money and time. In a huge empire where provincial governors had considerable autonomy, change did not happen evenly. Some garrisons on exposed frontiers remained underpaid, under-equipped, living off the land in ways that made them feared as much by nearby villagers as by enemy scouts. When internal unrest flared, it often involved those same frustrated armed men. In Anatolia, waves of rebellion in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, often called the Celali uprisings, turned stretches of countryside into war zones. Some rebels wrapped themselves in religious language, others in the banner of loyalty to a different prince, but underneath lay similar themes: economic strain, dislocation, the breakdown of older patronage networks. Putting down these movements required troops, money, and attention that might otherwise have gone to frontier campaigns. All of this made the empire more brittle at the edges, and those edges were busy places. To the west, the Habsburgs watched, learned, and slowly rebuilt. They had their own crises: religious conflict, succession disputes, the sprawling distractions of a dynasty that ruled Spain, parts of Italy, and the Americas. But over time, especially in their Austrian branch, they developed more robust ways of raising money from their lands and negotiating with local estates to maintain larger, more permanent forces. The long Ottoman-Habsburg War of 1593 to 1606, sometimes called the Long War, was an early sign of how grinding the new style of conflict could be. It was not a single climactic campaign, but a series of sieges and counter-sieges, years of attrition along the Hungarian frontier. Both sides bled men and treasure. Neither achieved a decisive breakthrough. The eventual peace at Zitvatorok in 1606 did not redraw the map dramatically, but it did quietly adjust something symbolic. The Habsburg ruler was no longer listed as a mere king, paying tribute to a superior sultan, but as an emperor more nearly on equal footing. Symbols matter in politics. They hint at how both sides were recalibrating their sense of the balance of power. To the south, Venice, small in land, large in ships, continued to test Ottoman strength in the eastern Mediterranean. Naval wars over Cyprus and Crete in the late 16th and 17th centuries dragged on for years. Battles like Lepanto in 1571, where a Christian coalition led by the Spanish and Venetians destroyed an Ottoman fleet, did not shatter Ottoman control of the sea lanes. The empire rebuilt its ships. But they signalled that the age of effortless maritime dominance was over. Venice, allied with or supported by other European powers, could inflict real damage, tie down resources, and chip away at Ottoman prestige. To the east, the Safavid Empire in Iran remained a persistent, ideologically charged rival. Ottomans and Safavids fought over control of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and eastern Anatolia in recurring wars. These were not border skirmishes. They were full-scale campaigns with sieges, massacres, deportations, costly for both sides. When the Ottomans pushed east, they relieved pressure on the Habsburg frontier but stretched their own logistics. When they turned west, they risked Safavid advances. The empire rarely enjoyed the luxury of focusing on a single enemy. Seen from a distance, it can be tempting to wrap all these strains into a single word: decline. For a long time, that was the dominant story in many textbooks. The Ottomans supposedly peaked under Suleiman and then slid into corruption, decadence, and military backwardness until European powers inevitably overtook them. Some contemporaries in Istanbul even use similar language themselves, lamenting that the old order had decayed and that sultans no longer lived up to their ancestors. But many modern historians are wary of that neat arc. When they look closely, they see an empire that was changing rather than simply rotting. State offices became more bureaucratic and less purely military. Tax systems were restructured, sometimes clumsily, sometimes effectively. New elites rose from different backgrounds. Old ones adapted or were sidelined. Some provinces suffered terrible disruption. Others saw periods of growth and relative stability. In certain fields, art, religious scholarship, provincial governance, there was creativity, not just stagnation. From this angle, decline looks less like a smooth downward slope, and more like a series of uneven transformations. Gains in some areas, losses in others, resilience here, vulnerability there. What is clearer is that politics at the centre in Istanbul had ripple effects far away on those riverbanks in Hungary and those highland forts in Croatia and Transylvania. The Sultan remained, in theory, the supreme authority. But over the 17th century, real power often slid among different clusters of elites. Grand viziers from powerful families, high-ranking military officers, religious officials, palace factions, even the mothers and wives of sultans who navigated court politics with considerable skill. When a strong Grand Vizier held office for years, He might pursue a coherent strategy, prioritize the Eastern Front, say, or invest heavily in a naval war, or negotiate a breathing space with the Habsburgs. When court intrigue led to rapid turnover, viziers rising and falling within months, policies could zigzag. Promises made to border commanders might be forgotten, pay for distant garrisons might be delayed. Negotiators in Vienna or Venice might not be sure whether their opposite numbers could actually deliver on agreements. From a fortress in royal Hungary, staring across a river at an Ottoman-held town, this might appear simply as inconsistency. One year, the Ottoman governor across the water is aggressive, probing, raiding. The next he seems cautious, more interested in collecting taxes than risking a clash. Behind those changes lay arguments in chancelleries and council chambers hundreds of miles away. From a village in central Anatolia, watching yet another band of soldiers tramp through on their way to put down a Kalali revolt, it might feel like neglect. Why could the Sultan not keep order closer to home? Why were taxes rising? But from the palace's vantage point, these crises were connected. Money lavished on the Danube frontier could not be spent on calming internal unrest, and vice versa. Choices about which governor to trust in Baghdad influenced how much attention could be spared for Bosnia or Croatia. By the later 17th century, the sense that the old balance was wobbling was not limited to scholars or diplomats. It seeped into the self-understanding of the empire's rulers. Some in Istanbul believed that bold, high-profile victories could restore both revenue and prestige. A decisive success against a familiar European rival might persuade internal critics that the state was still vigorous. It might also give negotiators leverage in Venice, in Warsaw, in Paris. And on the Danube frontier there were always unfinished questions. Disputed fortresses, complaints about raids, arguments over whether treaties had truly settled the status of this valley or that town. In that context, the idea of renewing a major push against the Habsburgs did not come out of nowhere. It grew out of decades of tension and calculation, of fears about encirclement, of hopes that one more big campaign could reassert Ottoman primacy in Central Europe. The landscape you saw earlier, those bastions, those double loyal villages, that uneasy breathing space between Vienna and Buda, was about to become the stage for another act. This time, when the Ottomans moved, Vienna would matter in a different way than it had in Suleiman's day, and the empire pressing at its walls would not be exactly the same one that had turned a Hungarian king into a legend in the mud at Mohacs. If you stand in the streets of Istanbul in the 1670s and listen carefully, not to the muezzins or the merchants, but to the murmurs in council chambers, you start to hear a particular word again and again. Vienna, not shouted, not yet the stuff of poetry or sermon, more like an idea that keeps sliding back onto the agenda whenever strategy is discussed. A place on the map that refuses to stay quiet. On paper, things do not look hopeless for the Ottomans at this moment. There have been victories in Crete. The Safavids are not pressing as hard as in some earlier decades. Trade flows through the empire's ports. The Janissaries still march when called. The Sultan's Tugra still flies on decrees across 3 continents. But something gnaws at the people whose careers depend on reading the wind. They know that reputation is a kind of currency. Once spent, it is hard to replenish with half measures. If you follow one man in particular, Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, you begin to see how a city hundreds of miles upriver can become the focal point for a lifetime's calculation. Kara Mustafa rises not from the old military aristocracy of frontier beys, but from the newer world of palace households and bureaucratic families. He is ambitious, clever, deeply embedded in the Köprülü network that has dominated Ottoman politics for a generation. Under his patron and then father-in-law, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, and later his brother-in-law Fasıl Ahmed Pasha, the empire had seen a kind of restoration, disciplined campaigns, reforms meant to rein in unruly soldiers, renewed energy on the Hungarian front. By the time Kara Mustafa himself becomes Grand Vizier in 1676, that legacy weighs on him like armour that is both protective and constricting. He has to live up to it, preferably surpass it. A cautious, uneventful tenure will not do. When he looks northwest, he does not just see a Habsburg fortress system. He sees a stage on which a grand, decisive performance might be mounted. Vienna has always been more than a dot on the Danube. Geographically, it sits at the point where the river bends from flowing west-east to turning southeast, at the mouth of the gap between the Alps and the Carpathians. Control Vienna, and you do not magically control Central Europe, but you do sit at a hinge. You can push into Bohemia and Moravia, threaten the German principalities, lean on Bavaria. You can also anchor your hold on Western Hungary, using the city as a shield against counterattacks. For the Habsburgs, Vienna is not just a capital, it is a last redoubt. Lose it, and the dynasty's Austrian lands fracture. The court must flee. Negotiations with princes in the Holy Roman Empire begin from a position of begging, not bargaining. For Ottoman strategists, Vienna has long been something else, the outer gate of a world that once seemed to lie open. Suleiman's army had stood outside these walls in 1529. The memory lingers in chronicles and in the stories told by frontier families. The siege had failed, plagued by rain, cold, disease, supply problems. But even failure had left an echo. The image of Ottoman banners within sight of the Habsburg court had become proof of how far the empire could reach when it chose to. Over the next century and a half, Vienna became a kind of shorthand inside Ottoman political language. Marching to Vienna did not always mean literally besieging it. It could mean launching a major European campaign, asserting dominance over the Danube basin, forcing the emperor into terms. Now, as the 17th century winds down, the word begins to carry a new flavour. For the Habsburgs, Vienna's survival in earlier crises has become part of their self-image. A Catholic bulwark, a city that held out in 1529, a symbol of resistance not only to Ottomans but to chaos, Protestant rebellions, peasant uprisings, rival claimants. For the Ottomans, Vienna is one of the few great Christian capitals that has never been folded into the House of Islam. Constantinople, of course, is theirs. Buda is theirs, Belgrade is theirs, Venice, Rome, Madrid, Paris. Remain remote names, farther than the empire has ever struck. Vienna sits tantalizingly closer, like a locked door at the end of a corridor they have walked for generations. By itself, symbolism does not move tens of thousands of men. It needs a spark. That spark lies in part in Hungary. If you drift east from Vienna along the Danube and up into the Hungarian plain in the 1670s and early 1680s, you find a patchwork of loyalties and resentments. Royal Hungary, under Habsburg rule, is still a frontier zone. Local nobles chafe under imperial attempts to centralise, to impose stricter Catholic conformity after the traumas of the 30 Years' War. Many of those nobles are Calvinist or Lutheran. They remember older Hungarian liberties and privileges. They resent German officials and soldiers. In 1671, the Habsburgs crush a conspiracy of Hungarian magnates. In the aftermath, many estates are confiscated. Protestants complain of persecution. Exiles and rebels begin to look for patrons abroad. Some drift toward Transylvania, that semi-independent principality that has long played off Ottomans and Habsburgs against each other. Others quietly send feelers to Istanbul. This is not abstract to Kara Mustafa. From his perspective, unrest in Hungary is not just a problem for the emperor. It is an opportunity. If dissident Hungarian nobles can be encouraged, if Transylvania can be nudged, if local garrisons can be tempted or intimidated, the Habsburg defensive line might unravel without a dozen bloody sieges. And outside the immediate frontier, the diplomatic chessboard is shifting. France under Louis XIV watches the Habsburgs with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility. The Sun King has his own designs on the Rhineland and the Spanish succession. A Habsburg Empire fully focused on the Danube might be a dangerous rival. A Habsburg Empire distracted, bleeding on its eastern frontier might be more pliable. Envoy move quietly between Paris and Istanbul. Messages are phrased cautiously, deniable if leaked. But the broad implication is hard to miss. If the Ottomans press the Habsburgs hard in the east, France is unlikely to come riding to Vienna's rescue with a grand crusading army. To the north, Poland-Lithuania, the vast commonwealth that stretches from the Baltic into today's Ukraine, has its own troubles. Swedish wars, Cossack uprisings, Russian pressure, internal factionalism. It is not obvious, in 1681 or 1682, that the Polish king will or can march to save Vienna if it is besieged. From Istanbul, the Habsburg emperor can be made to look isolated, one major ally more hostile, one potential rescuer distracted, his own Hungarian subjects discontented. Inside the Ottoman capital, voices differ on what to do with this picture. Some counsel caution. They point out that big European wars are expensive and that the empire has many fronts. They remember the headaches of the Long War decades earlier, years of fight and siege with no decisive payoff. Others, including Kara Mustafa, see ripeness. They argue that the empire cannot simply sit behind old treaties while rivals strengthen. That prestige lost to Venice at sea or to the Safavids in the east can be regained with a spectacular victory in the west. That Hungary's unrest is a once-in-a-generation chance to push the frontier further than in Suleiman's day. In their minds, Vienna is not an impossible dream. It is the logical culmination of pressure that has been building for a century and a half. Ambition, in such rooms, often wears the clothes of inevitability. Kara Mustafa nurtures grand visions. Later chroniclers will attribute to him dreams of riding into Vienna, forcing the emperor to kneel, perhaps even turning the city into a new administrative centre under an Ottoman governor. How much of this is embroidery after the fact is hard to say, but what is clear is that he wanted something more than another limited border campaign that ended with a small fortress changing hands. He wanted a victory that would silence critics, enrich his followers, and inscribe his name in the empire's long memory beside men like Suleiman and the great Cuprulus. He also believed, not unreasonably, that circumstances favoured a gamble. He knew the Habsburgs had recently been tied up in wars elsewhere. He knew their treasury was not bottomless. He believed Hungarian discontent could be turned into defections or at least into confusion behind enemy lines. He thought French diplomacy would keep Western Europe from uniting quickly. All these calculations were made without any guarantee of how other courts would actually respond once cannons opened fire under Vienna's walls. In Warsaw, in Rome, in the small courts of German princes, diplomats read rumours and dispatches with their own biases. Some saw an Ottoman thrust toward Vienna as confirmation of old fears, the Turk at the gates of Christendom. Others saw it as a chance to bargain for concessions from a frightened emperor. Still others simply hoped the storm would pass them by. No one, in 1682, could know that within a few years schoolchildren and preachers would be invoking this siege as a turning point for centuries. To people living through it, the coming campaign looked like one more in a long series of great wars. Dangerous, yes, important, certainly, but part of the familiar rhythm of frontier struggle. When couriers began to ride out from Istanbul with orders for provisions, when smiths in Anatolian towns were told to turn out nails and horseshoes, when oarsmen were summoned for river flotillas, they were not told they were preparing for the famous siege of Vienna that will echo through history. They were told they were serving the Sultan in a major campaign against the emperor. The sense of scale would only be clear later. What contemporaries could sense, Ottoman, Habsburg, Hungarian, Polish, was that something larger than usual was assembling on the horizon. Rumours of troop numbers were bigger, lists of artillery pieces longer. The language used in court was more exalted. Vienna mattered again, not because everyone secretly knew this would be a civilizational showdown, but because so many threads, political ambition, frontier unrest, diplomatic rivalry, the hunger for prestige, had become knotted around its walls. When the great host finally began to move up the Danube in 1683, it did so under the weight of those expectations and hopes, not under the label that later ages would pin to it. From the vantage point of that marching army, Vienna was still a future tense, a promise, a problem to be solved. No one yet imagined it as the place where a thunder of hooves from the north would write an ending that neither Kara Mustafa nor his Habsburg opponents had quite planned for. If you stand on a hill southeast of Vienna on a June morning in 1683, you see dust before you see men, a low brown haze along the Danube, thickening hour by hour, as if someone is smudging the edge of the horizon with their thumb. Under that smear something moves. Columns, wagons, horses, cannon, a city on the march, made of canvas and wood and iron and flesh. Word has gotten ahead of them. Villagers along the route have been hearing it for weeks. The great Ottoman host is coming, not a raiding force, not a punitive expedition taking 1 or 2 fortresses, an army like in the songs about Suleiman. Some rumours say 100,000 men, some say 200,000. Numbers grow in the telling, but the core is true. This is not ordinary. Inside Vienna, they read those rumours with the same mixture of disbelief and dread that you might feel watching a storm forecast announce the once-in-a-century hurricane headed straight for your coast. At first, life continues with an odd double vision. Merchants still open their shops, children still chase each other in courtyards, priests still chant the offices, but there is a faster, anxious rhythm beneath it all. Wagons creak into the city piled with grain, barrels, tools, blacksmiths work late, carpenters are summoned to shore up walls, repair bastions, build more palisades. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold does not wait to play hero on the walls. When it becomes clear this is not bluster, that Kara Mustafa's army really is swinging west and not turning aside, the court begins to evacuate. It is a moment that will later be painted as shameful flight or prudent strategy, depending on who is telling the story. But for the people watching caravans of nobles roll out the gates, it looks like something simpler. Their betters are leaving, and the storm will break without them. Into that vacuum steps Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the military governor. He is not an emperor. He cannot conjure allies out of thin air. What he can do is count. He counts gunpowder and cannonballs. He counts barrels of flour and salted meat. He counts how many mouths those supplies will need to feed if the siege lasts weeks or months. He counts how many men he can actually put on the walls. The answer is not comforting. Vienna at this moment is not a perfectly prepared fortress brimming with elite troops. It has solid modern bastions, yes, rebuilt after earlier threats. It has artillery. It has veterans. But many soldiers stationed in the region are scattered in garrisons elsewhere. Some have been swept away with the court. Others will trickle in as the ring tightens, but the defenders will never be numerous compared to the sea outside. Starhemberg does what siege commanders have done for centuries. He closes the gates to more refugees once he believes the city cannot sustain extra mouths. This means turning away desperate peasants beating on the doors, begging to be let in. It means watching them scatter into the fields, hoping to outrun an army no one can outrun. Those already inside are trapped within by that same decision. By early July, the dust on the horizon resolves into banners and tents. From the ramparts, defenders watch the Ottoman vanguard spread out like spilled ink across the landscape. Units peel off to seize outer works and surrounding villages. Engineered movement, not chaos. earthworks begin to rise opposite the walls even before the last contingents have arrived. Kara Mustafa does not rush to fling his army in a frontal assault. He has read enough campaigns to know that stone and artillery favour the patient. Siege warfare in the late 17th century is a kind of brutal geometry. If you imagine the city as a polygon of bastions and curtain walls, each angle designed to cover the one next to it with overlapping fire, the besieger's task is to gnaw his way closer in a matching series of lines. Trenches are dug in zigzags and parallels, each one nearer to the walls, shielding men from direct cannon fire. Batteries of Ottoman guns are hauled into position, their wooden carriages braced, their muzzles inched forward. The first salvos have a ritual quality. Cannon roar from both sides, rolling across the river, echoing back from the hills. Stone and iron balls smash into earth and masonry. Dust fountains up from parapets. Men cheer or cross themselves or say the basmala. But within days this spectacle dulls into the background noise of siege life. Regular thunder, occasional screams, constant rebuilding. Artillery alone rarely destroys a well-designed fortress quickly. It chips, cracks, dismounts defending guns, wears down morale. The real teeth of the siege sink in underground. Ottoman engineers, many of them specialists from the Balkans and Anatolia, begin to drive tunnels, mines toward the bastions. They work in teams, sometimes by lantern light, sometimes in stale air that makes torches gutter. Timber props hold up the shallow roofs. Barrels of powder are dragged in behind them, ready to be packed under the foundations of walls. Inside the city the defenders listen, literally. Countermine teams spread out along the inner side of the works with simple tools, picks, shovels, and their own hearing. They lie with ears pressed to the ground, to wooden planks, to barrels turned into crude amplifiers. At night, when the booming of artillery is less frequent, they strain to catch a different sound. Scraping, tapping, the distant thud of earth being moved where no earth should be moving. Sometimes they guess right. A countermine will break into an Ottoman tunnel. In the cramped, dark space, men who never see each other's faces jab with pikes, fire pistols, throw grenades, ceramic or wooden containers packed with powder, nails, stones. There is no room to maneuver, barely room to swing. If the defenders are fast, they can flood the tunnel, burn the supports, or drag out the powder barrels before they are lit. Sometimes they guess wrong. An Ottoman mine reaches its target undetected. A fuse is touched with a slow match. Minutes later, the ground under a bastion ripples like a living thing. Stone jumps. Earth erupts. A section of wall that has stood for decades becomes a jagged crater. Dust fills the air. Musketeers on the parapet vanish. For a few terrible moments, there is silence. Then the real work begins. Ottoman assault parties, already waiting in the nearest forward trenches with ladders and fascines, bundles of sticks to fill ditches, rush toward the new breach. Drums beat, officers shout. From the rubble, stunned defenders scramble up with whatever weapons they can find to meet men who have been rehearsing this charge for weeks. These are the most desperate fights of the siege. No elegant geometry here, no studied distance. It is hand to hand in a landscape of broken stone. Pikes, swords, axes, musket butts. Bodies trip over torn gabions, those wicker baskets filled with earth that once reinforced the parapet. Blood slicks the rubble. Starhemberg is everywhere in these moments, or seems to be, riding or limping from bastion to bastion, cursing, pleading, promising. Chroniclers describe him personally directing guns to be dragged up and re-emplaced to sweep any gap with grapeshot. He knows that once an attacking force can flood through a breach in numbers, the rational calculus of siege lines evaporates. The city becomes a street fight, and the advantage shifts. So the defenders pour men into every hole. Militia, regular soldiers, volunteers from guilds, students. Civilians who a month earlier were counting coins in a shop now find themselves heaving stones over the parapet or carrying water to exhausted gunners. Women tend the wounded, yes, but some also carry tri-charges of powder under fire, or man the pumps when fires break out from hotshot, heated cannonballs smashing into rooftops. Life inside the walls compresses into a strange routine marred by sudden terror. There are days when the bombardment slackens and people creep into courtyards to snatch a glimpse of sky not framed by battlements. Children, if their parents allow it, play in cellars. Priests lead processions, statues borne through streets under falling dust, prayers rising like one more plume of smoke. Then there are nights when everyone sleeps in their clothes, boots near the bed, because word has spread that a new mine may be ready. Bells are hung near certain bastions to be rung if the ground trembles, an alarm for the entire district to grab arms and run. Disease moves quietly through crowded quarters. Food is rationed more strictly as weeks drag on. Horses, once a symbol of status, begin to look less like transport and more like potential meat. These grim calculations are made in whispered council meetings, not yet announced to the public, but the city feels the tightening belt even without hearing the exact numbers. Outside, the siege works creep closer. From the walls, the Hungarian plain that once looked open now seems like a chessboard filled with Ottoman pieces. New parallels have been dug, fresh batteries thrown up, mortars installed to lob bombs over the ramparts and into the heart of the city. At night, the besiegers' camp glows with thousands of small fires, a ring of orange embers hemming the darkness. For the soldiers out there, the experience is a mirror of the defenders, distorted. They too eat coarse rations and drink brackish water. They too are woken by alarms when a sally party from the city bursts out to burn a battery or spike guns. They work in the trenches under fire, shoveling earth that spits chips of lead when musket balls hit. They listen to sermons and speeches that promise reward, plunder, paradise, or promotion if the city falls. Kara Mustafa spends much of his time moving between observation posts and his lavish command tent, balancing two clocks in his mind. One is military. How many guns does he have in position? How fast are the trenches extending? How many effective soldiers remain after casualties and desertions? Are the miners making progress, or are they being thwarted by countermine after countermine? Each failed assault cost blood and morale. Each successful explosion opens a chance that must be exploited before the defenders can patch it. The other clock is political. How long before famine or disease inside Vienna forces Starhemberg to the table? How long before relief forces, if they come, can be expected to appear on the horizon? What signals are coming from his Tartar scouts, from Allied contingents, from spies watching the northern approaches? Inside the city, men are watching that same horizon from the opposite side. They climb the cathedral towers or the highest points of the walls and stare north and west until their eyes ache. Stories circulate, half fact, half hope, about the emperor negotiating with German princes, about the Polish king being petitioned to march, about papal envoys promising money and prayers. Information travels slowly. Rumour travels fast. 1 week, people whisper that the emperor has abandoned them, that no one will come. The next, someone claims to have seen signal fires in the distant hills, proof that an Allied army is on the move. Steinberg, who has to keep men fighting day after day, threads a narrow line between brutal honesty and sustaining belief. He cannot promise what he does not know, but he can insist with growing intensity that every day they hold makes relief more likely. As August burns into September, the two clocks tick louder. The Ottomans step up their efforts, launching more frequent assaults on newly blasted breaches, pressing their trenches so near that musketeers can sometimes hear each other shouting insults between volleys. The defenders grow thinner on the ground. Casualty lists lengthen. Powder stores shrink. The walls, once crisp lines on a plan, are becoming scars. For many inside Vienna, the question hardens into something simple and terrifying. Will the banner that appears first beyond that southern crest be Ottoman green, signalling that the siege works have finally punched through and the city will be taken by storm? Or will it be the penance of some long-promised relief force cresting the hills at the last possible moment, while the walls still, just barely, stand? Far to the north of those burning walls, men are arguing over maps. Not just sober military councils, but tense, layered conversations, where every sentence has two meanings. One for the war in front of them, one for the balance of power that will exist after the war is over. Leopold's flight from Vienna is not the end of his responsibility. In some ways, it's the beginning of his real work. From safer cities in the interior, imperial envoys ride in all directions, carrying letters that mix humility with pressure. They invoke Christendom, civilization, honour. They also invoke obligations from old treaties, debts of money and blood, promises made in calmer years when nobody believed a great Ottoman army would reach this far again. The first problem is simple. The Holy Roman Empire is not a unified state with a switch that Leopold can flip to raise an army. It is a patchwork of princes, bishops, free cities, each jealous of its own rights, each with its own worries. Some look east and see the Ottomans as an existential threat. Others look west and think about France, about Louis XIV eyeing the Rhineland. For them, sending troops to Hungary feels like leaving the front door open for a neighbour who has already tried to break in. The second problem is older and uglier. The memory of religious war in Central Europe is only a generation or two behind them. The 30 Years' War has ended within living memory, leaving towns burned, fields wasted, whole regions depopulated. Protestant and Catholic princes remember vividly how appeals to defend the true faith were used as excuses to strip them of rights, lands, and subjects. When Leopold's messengers talk about a grand Catholic coalition, more than one ruler hears something else. Habsburg centralization dressed up in pious language. And yet, the image of Vienna under siege by the Ottoman army has a gravitational pull that's hard to resist. Maps in these council chambers make the point with brutal clarity. If that city falls, the long Danube corridor opens. The road to the west is smoother. Fortresses that now form a second line will become the first. Merchants whisper about what will happen to trade. Priests and pastors, often divided, now preach on the same theme. If Vienna goes, what comes next? Into this complicated landscape steps a figure who, on paper, should be the least eager to help. The King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, John III Sobieski. Poland-Lithuania is itself a sprawling, unstable commonwealth, stretching from the Baltic almost to the Black Sea. It has its own long history with the Ottomans and their clients, especially the Tatars of the Crimean Khanate, who have raided its southeastern borders for generations. It also has internal factions that distrust the Habsburgs, factions that would rather see Poland pivot toward France or maintain a careful neutrality. Sobieski knows all of this. He has spent years balancing these parties, sometimes fighting them outright. He's not just a king. He's a seasoned soldier with scars and a memory crowded with campaigns. Before anyone in Vienna knows his name, he has already built a reputation along the eastern frontiers as a commander who understands steppe warfare, who can read the movements of Tatar horsemen the way a hunter rids the wind. His greatest triumph before Vienna is still talked about around Polish campfires, the Battle of Kotin in 1673, where he led outnumbered troops against an Ottoman army and won decisively. That victory and others like it give him a particular kind of authority when the question of marching to Vienna arises. He's not some courtier chasing glory in a new theatre. He's a man who has fought the same enemy before and on the field beaten them. Still, when papal envoys and Habsburg diplomats flood his court with appeals, it is not obvious that he will go. On the one hand, a papal alliance has advantages. The Pope is willing to send money, to frame this as a holy war that raises Sobieski's status across Catholic Europe. A treaty is hammered out in which Poland, Lithuania and the Habsburgs pledge mutual assistance against the Ottomans. Sobieski extracts key promises, including support against his own eastern enemies, because he knows that every regiment he marches west leaves someone else at his own borders. On the other hand, Polish nobles, the Szlachta, hold enormous power. The king cannot simply decree and be obeyed. Sejm sessions, gatherings of the nobility are full of scepticism. Some argue that Austria has never rushed to save Polish towns when Tatars burned them. Others point out the cost in coin and lives. Why bleed for Vienna when there are Cossacks restless on the Dniester? Sobieski argues back with a mixture of realism and faith. He paints a picture of a Europe where, if Vienna falls, the Ottomans will have more leverage to press into lands much closer to Polish interests. He speaks of Christian solidarity, yes, but he also speaks of geopolitics. A Habsburg monarchy crushed or humiliated would leave France stronger, the Ottomans bolder, and Poland-Lithuania more isolated than ever. His charisma and military authority carry the day. Barely. The decision to march is not the natural outflow of some united Christian will. It is the outcome of bargaining, speech after speech, promises made, reputations put on the line. Even at the end, there are nobles who refuse, officers who drag their feet, contingents that never materialize. When Sobieski finally sets out, he leads not just Polish troops, but the core of his kingdom's striking power. The famed winged hussars and other cavalry, infantry, artillery, thousands of men who know their king will not sit safely behind them. He rides in armour, not robes, and that matters. As he moves south and west, others are converging. Imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine gather from scattered garrisons and levies. Bavarian, Saxon and Swabian contingents march under their own colours, led by princes who have signed on for reasons that mix fear, piety and calculation in different proportions. Some come because they genuinely believe that the defence of Vienna is the defence of Christendom. Others come because they do not want to be remembered as the prince who stayed home if the city falls and the Ottomans push further. Coordination is a nightmare. There is no single unified staff with modern communications. There are letters, couriers, pre-arranged meeting points. Roads are bad, bridges rickety. Summer storms turn tracks into mud. Supply trains lag behind. Commanders worry not only about the enemy in front, but about their allies to the side. Who will take precedence in battle? Who will pay for damages when foreign troops march through a region and eat its grain? More than once units arrive late to a rendezvous and tempers flare. Suspicion hangs in the air. Will the Poles actually come in force? Will the imperial generals sacrifice Saxon or Bavarian troops first to preserve their own? Is this whole coalition real, or is everyone just looking for a way to claim they tried without risking too much? Timing makes everything worse. Each day the relief army spends arguing, or stuck behind a swollen river, is another day that mines go off under Vienna's walls. Starhemberg's couriers slip out through Ottoman lines with desperate messages, urging speed, describing new breaches, dwindling powder. Not all of them make it, but enough do that Sobieski and his allies feel the clock ticking. The march becomes a test of endurance and improvisation. Bridges are thrown together. Foraging parties scour countryside already strained by Ottoman requisitions and refugee flows. At night, around campfires, soldiers repeat rumours about what is happening at Vienna, stories that may be outdated by the time they reach them. Some nights the talk is hopeful. The city still holds, will be in time. Other nights it's darker. By the time we arrive, there'll be nothing but smoke and bones. Yet the army grows. Each day brings more banners, more wagons, more languages in the din. Latin in the chaplain's prayers, German in orders, Polish curses, Hungarian scouts slipping in with reports. The coalition, for all its internal friction, is becoming a physical fact, something that will be very hard to unwind without moving forward. When Sobieski finally meets the main imperial forces, rank and precedence have to be negotiated again. Who will command over all? In theory, this is straightforward. Sobieski is a crowned head, a king, and in the etiquette of European politics that outranks dukes and electors, in practice, commanders like Charles of Lorraine have been fighting this campaign from the beginning. They know the ground, have bled in earlier engagements, and have their own views about tactics. Again, the solution is not automatic. It is the product of hours of discussion, of carefully phrased agreements that let everyone save face. In the end, Sobieski is acknowledged as overall commander, particularly for the coming battle, but with significant input from the imperial and German princes. It is a compromise that holds because all of them understand the alternative, a fractured army that never dares to risk a decisive encounter. The last stage of the approach brings them to a line of hills and wooded ridges northwest of Vienna, rising above the Danube Valley. If you could stand there and look down, you'd see why these heights matter. The Kahlenberg and its neighbouring slopes form a rough arc, a natural balcony over the plain where the Ottoman camp sprawls. From here, an army can look directly across at the siege works, see the pattern of trenches, the gleam of tents, the smoke of cook fires. Paths twist down through vineyards and scrub toward the back of Kara Mustafa's position. But the terrain is no parade ground. The woods are thick in places, the ridges broken. Moving thousands of men, horses and guns along these narrow routes will be slow, noisy, confusing. Missteps could send units tumbling out of cover too early, piecemeal, into the open where Ottoman artillery and cavalry might tear them apart. Standing on those heights as the coalition army filters into position, commanders feel two conflicting sensations. Relief. They have arrived. The city is still there, its walls scarred but not fallen, its towers still visible beyond the smoke, and apprehension. The hardest part is ahead. All the negotiation, all the marching, all the fragile agreements have brought them to a place where one day's fighting will decide not only Vienna's fate but the credibility of this entire alliance. Night falls over the Kahlenberg with men and horses still moving, still whispering, still praying. Below, in the Ottoman lines and inside Vienna's walls, watchers see new fires flicker in the hills and cannot yet know exactly what they mean. By dawn, everyone will. You wake to the sound of men already moving, not the sharp drum beats of a modern army, just the low, continuous murmur of thousands of voices, the creak of leather, the clink of metal, horses snorting in the chill air on the Kahlenberg. Dawn is still a suggestion more than a fact, a paling of the eastern sky above the smoky curtain that hangs over Vienna. Somewhere nearby, John Sobieski has been awake for hours. Commanders in that era rarely sleep well before battle. He has to think about more than courage. He has to think about sequences. Who moves first? Where the weight of his army will fall. How to keep this coalition from tripping over itself once the fighting begins. The plan that emerges is simple in outline and complicated in execution, like most battle plans. On the left, closest to the Danube, imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine will descend first. They know this ground better than anyone else in the alliance. They've been skirmishing in these valleys and vineyards for weeks. Their job is to hit the northern wing of the Ottoman positions, pull attention and pressure away from the city walls, and keep the enemy from rolling up the coalition line from that direction. In the centre, contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, and smaller German states will move after the Imperials, stepping down through the broken slopes. Solid infantry, some cavalry, some guns dragged painfully along the ridges. They are the hinge of the line meant to keep contact between left and right, to absorb and return the shock when Ottoman units counterattack. On the right, Sobieski keeps his Polish forces massed slightly back, especially the cavalry. The winged hussars are not meant to be the first into the morning's fighting. They are the instrument for later, when the field has clarified, when there is room to run. Until then, Polish infantry and lighter cavalry will edge down the wooded hills, anchoring the coalition's outer flank. It is one thing to sketch these arrows on a map under lamplight, another to translate them into motion in half-darkness across tangled, unfamiliar slopes. The first light shows men slipping, swearing, steadying each other as they lead horses along narrow paths. Gun carriages catch on roots. Units lose sight of their own banners in the undergrowth and have to halt, listen, reorient. Music and shouted orders would travel, give away positions, so much is done in gesture and low voice. Coordination is not a neat, precise ballet. It is more like a river finding its course through stones and fallen trees, spreading, pooling, being forced back into channels. Down below, in the Ottoman camp, there is also motion. Kara Mustafa has not spent the night in ignorance. Scouts and sentries have been watching the strange glow on the hills, listening for the far-off sounds of an army on the move. Reports trickle in. Large forces, not just a diversion, gathering on the heights. He faces a set of choices as brutal as any field commander's. His army is spread out in a horseshoe around Vienna, siege trenches and gun batteries pressed close to the walls, camps and reserves thrown out in depth behind them. For weeks, every decision has been about squeezing the city tighter, pushing forward saps and mines, battering at bastions. Now all at once there is a threat at his back. To turn fully toward the relief army would mean loosening the noose around Vienna, pulling men and guns away from the siege lines. To ignore the relief army and focus on the city risks being struck from behind, cut apart between walls and hills. He tries to do both. Orders go out to swing portions of the army toward the Kahlenberg slopes, to form a defensive front along the streams and fields that lie between the heights and the siege works. Infantry battalions, cavalry regiments, artillery pieces grind into motion. But this is not a clean pivot on an empty plain. It is a reorientation of a machine already in mid-operation, with pieces sunk in trenches, sprawled in camps, scattered in foraging parties. By mid-morning, the two great organisms begin to feel each other. On the coalition left, imperial troops finally shake themselves into coherent lines as they emerge from the trees. Ahead of them, Ottoman units have rushed to occupy the villages and low ridges. The first exchanges are not grand charges but probing fights. Skirmishers slipping between hedges, muskets cracking, artillery testing range. For the Imperials, this is familiar work. Charles of Lorraine has been retreating and counter-attacking for months to keep this side of the Danube from collapsing. His men know the feel of Ottoman volleys, the patterns of their cavalry probes. They push forward, take a hamlet, are thrown back, then reform and try again. Every yard they gain pulls Ottoman attention northward, away from the city's most vulnerable bastions. In the centre, Bavarian and Saxon infantry descend more slowly. Their officers are manoeuvring not just against the enemy, but also to avoid gaps with their allies. The terrain here is broken, with ravines and small streams cutting the approach. Units appear and disappear from each other's view as they move. At times it feels less like a single line advancing and more like a collection of separate thrusts groping for a common front. The Ottomans press them hard. For all the later stories about disorganized collapse, much of this day is a grinding, balanced fight. Janissary units, still the elite infantry of the empire, come forward in disciplined ranks, their own artillery firing from hastily chosen positions. Sipahi cavalry probe for flanks, looking for any sign that these German contingents are stretched too thin, too far from their supports. The weather, the ground, and the months of previous fighting all play their parts. For the Ottoman soldiers, this is not the first day in the field. They have been living in camps, digging trenches, carrying gabions, standing local watches, riding patrols, some of them for the entire summer. Heat, disease, boredom, sudden bursts of terror when mines went off under Vienna's walls, these have worn them down. The coalition troops are not fresh either. Many have marched for weeks, slept poorly, eaten irregularly. But they are not coming off a siege. They are leaning into a single day after a build-up of expectation and fear. In that sense, they have the psychological advantage of the attacker with a clear, finite task. Break through, relieve the city. As the sun climbs higher, the rhythm of the battle settles into something strangely methodical. Push, check, regroup, push again. On the left, imperial units secure more ground, pushing the Ottomans back toward their main camp. On the right, Polish infantry and some German contingents struggle through heavier woods and ravines. Here, the terrain slows everything. Commands dispatched from Sobieski's vantage point take time to reach the front. When they arrive, they may be acting on a situation that has already shifted. This lag is not a minor detail. It shapes when and where forces are committed. It means that what looks like hesitation from a bird's-eye map room perspective is, on the ground, men waiting because they quite literally cannot see whether their neighbours have advanced, whether a gap has opened, whether the moment is right. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg and his garrison do what they can to add to the pressure. The defenders have been conserving powder and men for just such a day. As they hear the roll of cannon from the hills, as they see the confusion begin to ripple through the Ottoman siege works, they launch sorties, targeted attacks from the gates against forward trenches and batteries. Small in number, often bloody, these thrusts force Kara Mustafa to divert some of his attention and resources back to the walls at the very moment he wants to concentrate them outward. By early afternoon, the Ottoman command situation is fraying. They are now fighting in two directions, outward toward the Kahlenberg heights, inward toward the city they still hope to take. Lines of communication across the sprawling camp are clogged by runners, couriers, officers trying to find units that have shifted position without orders. Signals are misinterpreted. Some contingents, hearing only that the enemy has appeared in strength on the heights, overreact and fall back too far, creating gaps. Others, more aggressive, countercharge local advances only to discover that neighbouring support has not moved. The coalition, for all its own coordination problems, is benefiting from a kind of structural simplicity. Its goal is one-directional, down from the heights, toward the Ottoman main line, then onto Vienna. Every yard forward reduces the space in which Kara Mustafa can manoeuvre, compressing his army against its own siege works. By mid-afternoon, the field has changed shape. What began as a series of scattered clashes has thickened into a continuous contact line. Imperial troops on the left have drawn level with many of the outer Ottoman camps. In places they are already overrun in tent lines, spiking guns that had been turned toward Vienna, not toward the hills. In the centre, Bavarian and Saxon infantry have forced their way onto more open ground, closer to the heart of the enemy position. On the right, the Polish line has at last descended far enough that cavalry can form in real numbers on gentler slopes. Sobieski has been waiting for this. If he throws them too early into broken ground and scattered fights, their power will dissolve into confusion. If he waits too long, darkness or some unexpected Ottoman rally could blunt the advantage. The timing is a calculation as much as an instinct. Look at the pattern by this hour. The Ottoman front is under pressure across its breadth. Units are trading ground, falling back, rallying, but always on balance, giving more than they take. Fires are beginning to rise in parts of the camp where tents have been seized or set alight. Dust and smoke blur the air. Noise makes coherent command harder with each passing minute. The coalition troops are tired, but they are now fighting with increasing confidence. Each captured gun, each recaptured trench, each Ottoman unit that breaks and runs a few dozen yards before being steadied, adds to a sense that the momentum has shifted. From his vantage point on the right, Sobieski can see more of this than most of his men. He can see imperial banners on the far side of the Ottoman camp, where none were in the morning. He can see the way Ottoman reserves are being fed in piecemeal, not in a neat, overwhelming counterstroke, but in dribs and drabs where the line looks thinnest. He also knows something that every experienced cavalry commander understands. When an enemy force is being compressed, forced to pivot and fight on multiple axes, there comes a moment where its ability to absorb shock collapses faster than its numbers would suggest. The day of battle has moved from misty uncertainty to this taut, dangerous clarity. Coalition infantry have done hours of brutal, uncelebrated work, fighting uphill and downhill, taking and losing vineyards and villages, moving guns forward, filling gaps, keeping the line from snapping. Imperial, Bavarian, Saxon, Swabian, Polish foot soldiers have all contributed to the slow unwinding of the Ottoman position. Now, as the sun begins to angle westward and the long shadows stretch across the trampled fields, the pieces are finally in place for something else. Relief forces are no longer just visible on the hills. They are pressing against the very heart of the Ottoman camp. The noose that had been around Vienna has been seized and pulled from the outside. The besiegers are in danger of becoming the besieged, squeezed between the city's sorties and the coalition's advancing line. One more element remains to be hurled into this shifting, exhausted, smoke-filled landscape. The Polish king has been saving it all day. Sobieski gives the order, and a message begins to ripple outward through the Polish lines. Not a single trumpet call that magically organizes thousands of horsemen at once, but a chain of shouted commands, riders spurring down the ranks, banner signals repeated from hill to hollow, units that have spent the day half engaged, screening, probing, holding the flank, begin to shift with a different kind of purpose. Men tighten girths, check straps and stirrups, glance to either side to see that their comrades are in place. Lances, some over 5 meters long, are raised and steadied. The great curved sabres that are almost an extension of a Polish cavalryman's arm hang ready at the hip. Those famous wings, arched wooden frames bristling with feathers, are adjusted on saddles or backs. Later paintings will make those wings enormous, theatrical, a forest of feathers blotting out the sky. The reality was more practical and more varied. Some hussars wore tall single frames, others had lower twin sets fixed to the saddle. Some probably rode with none at all on that particular day. But seen in mass, with sunlight catching wood and leather and metal, with pennons snapping from lance heads, the overall impression would still have been astonishing. They begin to move. At first it is just a walk, the long line shaking itself out along the gentler slopes below the woods. This is the part of a cavalry attack that never feels dramatic in the retelling but matters enormously in practice. Aligning squadrons, dressing the line, making sure no sudden dip in the ground will break formation just when speed begins to build. And the Polish are not alone. Alongside the corps of winged hussars ride other heavy horse from the Commonwealth. Panzerni, armoured cavalry with shorter lances and firearms. Lighter banners who will follow the first shock or exploit a breach. Mixed among them and on adjacent slopes are German and Austrian cavalry units, less celebrated in legend but very real in the contemporary accounts. Cuirassiers in metal breastplates, dragoons who have spent most of the day fighting on foot now remounting to join the advance. What is forming is not a single, perfectly straight wall of horse from horizon to horizon. It is a series of powerful columns and lines, echeloned across the coalition right, all angled toward one thing, the thickening sprawl of the Ottoman main camp and the battered units now trying to hold it. This is what hours of prior fighting have purchased. Down below, the Ottoman front is no longer a crisp, unbroken defensive line. It is a patchwork of engaged and disengaged units, of reserves already committed in haste, of batteries half-turned toward the hills, but with their fields of fire compromised by friendly troops in front. Trenches and embankments that were meant to face Vienna, not an army descending from the Kahlenberg, lie at odd angles to the new threat. Janissary companies are still fighting hard in places. Sipahi cavalry still have the discipline and skill that made them the Empire's shock arm for generations. But they are scattered, reacting to attacks from multiple directions at once. Messages from Kara Mustafa take longer and longer to find the intended recipients, if they find them at all. Some men are facing Vienna, some the coalition centre, some the Polish right, with little sense of the whole. Over and over in European sources you find the same phrase for this stage of the day. The Ottomans were disordered. That word can be misleading if you imagine instant chaos. Much of the army is still under control, still fighting, but the kind of control you need to absorb and blunt a massed cavalry charge, dense, contiguous formations, prepared ground, clear lanes of fire, is exactly what has been eroded by the long grinding battle. Sobieski has been waiting for that erosion. He rides forward with his own escort and chosen hussar banners at the centre of the forming wave. He is a king, but also an experienced cavalryman who has led charges before and knows what it feels like to gamble thousands of lives on momentum and timing. The stories that say he quoted a psalm, that he pointed his sabre and promised Vienna its salvation, are hard to verify. They sound like things chroniclers like to put into the mouths of victorious monarchs. What we can be reasonably sure of is that he put himself where his men could see him, in pre-modern battles that mattered as much as any inspiring phrase. Seeing your king in the front rank when you're about to hurtle downhill into musket fire is a powerful answer to the question that every soldier quietly asks. Are we really doing this? They shift from walk to trot. You can imagine the sensation if you were somewhere in that sea of horsemen, the ground beginning to thump in a steady, synchronized rhythm. The harness creaks, the breath of animals all around you. You're conscious of the men on either side, of the need to keep station, to not let fear or excitement pull you too far forward or back. Ahead, through the dust and smoke, the Ottoman positions swell into view. Tents, wagons, makeshift barricades thrown up in haste, artillery pieces drawn up at odd angles, clusters of infantry bristling with pikes and muskets, cavalry trying to form into their own countercharging lines. The Ottomans see the movement on the hills and begin to fire, muskets cracking, some guns letting loose. The range at first is long, horses go down, gaps open and are closed as riders swerve and press together again. The trot becomes a canter. Then, for the chosen leading banners, a full gallop. Here is where legend and reality begin to tangle. The traditional image is of some 12,000 Polish horse, all in one sweeping line, thundering down as the single largest cavalry charge in history. Modern historians tend to be more cautious. They suggest that the numbers for that final, concentrated wave of hussars and heavy cavalry were probably lower, and that the attack came in successive groups rather than a single perfectly simultaneous strike. But even if we imagine a smaller figure, several thousand heavy horse, supported by thousands more allied cavalry on the flanks, that is still an enormous mass of moving muscle and metal. Contemporary witnesses on both sides describe it in terms that are almost physical, the ground shaking, the sound like distant thunder rolling suddenly closer. For Ottoman soldiers already worn by a full day of combat, the psychological effect may have mattered as much as the physical impact. You've been fighting since morning, watching the enemy grind forward through villages and vineyards. You've been told that the relief army is dangerous, but that your own numbers and entrenchments are superior. You've seen your comrades pulled from one threatened point to another. You've watched the city you came to conquer stubbornly refuse to fall behind you. And now, late in the day, when your legs are heavy and your powder horns half empty, you look up and see a densely packed mass of cavalry bearing down from the hills you were supposed to control. The wings, the streaming banners, the sunlight on steel, the king himself in the foremost ranks. These are not just visual details, they are signals. They say, this is the moment your enemy believes will decide everything. The leading squadrons smash into the outer Ottoman defences. Where there are prepared trenches and stakes, they veer, or the first ranks check and try to pick their way. Where the ground is more open, especially around parts of the camp that have been laid out for siege, not for defending against a mounted onslaught, the horsemen break through with lethal effect. Lances drive into pike blocks and musket lines. Riders who lose their lance draw sabres and pistols, hacking, firing at close range. Behind and around them, more cavalry pile in, turning local breaches into spreading holes. This is not a single, clean, irresistible sweep. There are ugly, confused pockets where hussars are forced to dismount or are shot from the saddle, where Ottoman units hold firm and have to be attacked again. But the overall direction of the moment is unmistakable. Each place where Ottoman infantry are ridden down or forced to turn inward to face the cavalry creates a weakness facing someone else. Coalition infantry, seeing the horsemen erupt into the camp on the right, redouble their own efforts in the centre and left. They push forward to link with the mounted troops, to prevent the Ottomans from stabilising the line behind the first impact. The unravelling accelerates. Once some Ottoman units begin to fall back in earnest, leaving guns, tents, carts, others see the movement and interpret it, not unreasonably, as the beginning of a general retreat. Fear, in an army already stretched to its limits, is contagious. Officers shout, try to rally formations, but they are competing with the more primal messages carried by sight and sound. Comrades running, enemy cavalry inside the camp, enemy banners suddenly where your own had flown that morning. Kara Mustafa may still be issuing orders. Some contingents, especially farther from the point of impact, probably withdraw in reasonably good order at first, but for the troops closest to the Polish charge, the coherent idea of the siege of Vienna dissolves into something simpler: escape. Men cut free horses, abandon baggage, try to get out of the narrowing pocket between city, river and advancing coalition. In the pandemonium, whatever formal plan there might have been for an organised retreat toward Hungary is trampled by the instinct to save one's own life. This is why the charge, more than the sorties from Vienna or the hard fighting on the left, becomes the enduring symbol of the city's salvation. It is not because the Polish alone fought, or because one dramatic moment was all that mattered. Without the brutal infantry work of the preceding hours, without Charles of Lorraine's pressure on the northern flank, without Bavarian and Saxon troops grinding forward in the centre, there would have been no weakened line for Sobieski to break. But humans remember turning points. In memory, long processes compress into images. A king leading his cavalry downhill, winged warriors crashing into a besieger's camp, an army that had seemed unshakable just that morning breaking and scattering in the dust. For Vienna, for much of Europe, the story of this day will be told and retold with that image at its heart. Not just as a tale of tactics and terrain, but as a symbol of deliverance arriving at the last moment, of a frontier empire that had grown used to advancing, now rolling suddenly back. The reality beneath the legend is more complex, more collaborative, and full of contingencies. Yet there is still something true in the way people chose to remember it. From that late afternoon charge onward, the siege is no longer a question. It is a flight, and the long reach of the empire that had stretched from Algeria to Iraq has, for the first time in centuries, run hard into a limit it cannot simply push past. When night finally settles over the ruined earthworks and trampled camp, the Ottoman Empire is still very much alive. It still holds vast swathes of territory. It still commands fleets in the Mediterranean, governors in Egypt, tax collectors in the Balkans. The Sultan in Constantinople will not wake up the next morning to find his empire mysteriously vanished because one battle went badly on a hill above Vienna. Empires that big do not die in a single day. What did break that day was something more specific and in some ways just as important: a direction. For roughly 2 centuries, if you looked at a map of Europe and the Near East every few decades, the Ottoman frontier line had a habit of creeping. A fortress here, a province there, a vassal swallowed outright, a riverline crossed and then fortified. Sometimes there were setbacks, stubborn enemies, inconvenient defeats. But the long-term story, especially in southeastern Europe, had been one of advance. Vienna changes the slope of that story, not immediately, not cleanly, but decisively. Kara Mustafa's beaten army does not simply dissolve in the fields outside the city. It retreats, harshly, hurriedly, but with enough structure that many units make it back toward Hungary. There are still garrisons in strong fortresses. There are still loyal local elites. There is still the expectation in Constantinople that what has been lost in one season can be regained in the next. On the Christian side, there is a different realization. For decades, European powers had often faced the Ottomans separately. Venice at sea, Habsburgs on the land frontier, Poland in its own theatre, making ad hoc arrangements, sometimes even cutting deals with the Sultan against other Christian rivals. Vienna shows what coordinated effort can do. It shows that this army, which had seemed almost a force of nature in earlier generations, can be met, stopped, and driven back when enough states are willing to cooperate and accept the costs. Within months, that insight hardens into something more formal. In 1684, under the encouragement of Pope Innocent XI and the example of Vienna, a new coalition takes shape, the Holy League. It gathers together the Habsburg monarchy, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Venetian Republic, and, a little later, Muscovy. Very different states with very different agendas, but for this moment, overlapping enough that they agree on a shared project, pushing the Ottomans back. You can think of the Siege of Vienna as the dramatic opening scene. What follows is a long, grinding campaign season after season that rarely makes it into popular memory, but is where the strategic turning actually happens. The Habsburgs, energized by their victory and smelling opportunity, push east into royal Hungary and beyond. Towns and fortresses that have sat under the crescent flag for generations, Érsekújvár, Buda, later Belgrade, become targets in a slow, systematic offensive. Each siege is its own miniature Vienna. Trenches dug, artillery dragged into position, sorties and sallies, supply lines stretched and defended. The Ottomans do not simply collapse in the face of this advance. They counterattack. They win battles, they lose battles. Some campaigns bog down in disease and mud. There are still janissaries who fight fiercely, still provincial cavalry who know these landscapes far better than their enemies. In some years, the frontier barely moves at all, but the long run is unmistakable. The line that had once inched steadily toward the Alps begins, inch by inch, to recede. Elsewhere, Venice seizes islands and fortresses along the Dalmatian coast and in Greece, taking advantage of Ottoman distraction. Polish forces focus more on securing their own southern frontier and on the question of Moldavia and Podolia, the borderlands that had seen so much back and forth raiding. Muscovy, farther to the northeast, probes toward the Black Sea, beginning a trajectory that will, over the coming century, turn Russia into a major Black Sea power at Ottoman expense. This is what being stopped looks like in real time. Not a cliff, but a bend in the road. By the late 1690s, both sides are exhausted. The Holy League's victories have been substantial but not free. The Habsburgs have spent men and treasure. Poland has its own internal struggles. Venice's resources are finite. The Ottomans are dealing with unrest, money problems, and the political fallout of repeated failures. Everyone is tired of bleeding. Out of that mutual exhaustion comes a peace congress held in a small town you might never have heard of if you're not a specialist. Karlowitz, in present-day Serbia. In 1699, after long negotiations, the Treaty of Karlowitz is signed. Paper treaties can feel abstract, but what this one does is draw a new map in blunt lines. The Habsburg monarchy gains most of Hungary and Transylvania and large parts of Slavonia and Croatia. Venice receives significant territories in Dalmatia and the Peloponnese. Poland recovers Podolia and the fortress of Kamieniec-Podilski, lost to the Ottomans earlier in the century. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire formally cedes large, long-standing core European territories to Christian powers in a comprehensive peace settlement. Earlier setbacks had usually been framed as temporary, as the price of a bad campaign that could be reversed later. Karlowitz is different. It recognizes in treaty language that the frontier has moved, and not in the empire's favour. That is why many historians treat Karlowitz, rather than Vienna alone, as the true landmark in the changing balance of power. Vienna is the shock. The Holy League and the campaigns that follow are the prolonged struggle. Karlowitz is the moment when that whole process is acknowledged and fixed in law. For Ottoman prestige, this combination is bruising. The empire that had once taken Constantinople from the Byzantines, that had hammered at the gates of Vienna twice, that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean, now has to publicly accept the loss of territories that Ottoman chroniclers had long called everlasting possessions. In the internal politics of the empire, critics can point to these losses as proof that something is wrong. Perhaps with specific grand viziers, perhaps with military organisation, perhaps in more radical diagnoses, with the empire's whole way of keeping up with a changing Europe. It does not mean that the Ottomans become weak overnight. They will still reform, still fight major wars, still win battles in the 18th century and beyond. But the aura of relentless advance into Europe is gone. On the Habsburg side, the consequences are almost the mirror image. The House of Habsburg, which had spent so long defending its eastern frontier, suddenly finds itself in possession of vast new lands. Hungary and its neighbouring regions bring new revenue, new populations to govern, new nobles to integrate or manage. Vienna shifts from being a fortress near a dangerous border to a capital commanding an expanded Central European empire. This expansion will shape the Habsburg monarchy's identity for the next 2 centuries. The complicated ethnic and religious mosaic of its new holdings will both enrich it and create challenges that echo into the 19th and even 20th centuries. For the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the consequences are more bittersweet. In the immediate aftermath, Jan Sobieski's ride to Vienna becomes a central piece of Polish glory. Chroniclers and poets celebrate the hussars as saviours of Christendom. In Western Europe, for a time, the King of Poland is lionized as the man who came to Vienna's rescue when others hesitated. Yet Poland does not, in the long run, harvest the same territorial gains as the Habsburgs. Internal political problems, the liberum veto in its parliament, the pressures of powerful neighbours, all of these mean that the Commonwealth's moment of shining military prestige does not translate into a lasting boost in its structural position. In later centuries, when Poland is partitioned by those very neighbours, the memory of Vienna takes on a different flavour. It becomes one of those bright points in a narrative of loss. A day when Polish arms were decisive, when a Polish king rode at the front of a victorious coalition. As for the phrase "stopped forever," the kind of phrase you see on book covers and in patriotic speeches, it needs careful handling. The Ottoman Empire was not stopped forever in any absolute sense. It continued to function, to reform, to wage war on other fronts. Its story after 1683 is long and complex. But if we narrow the focus, if we look specifically at major expansion into Central Europe, deep thrusts toward the heart of the Habsburg lands, serious bids to take cities like Vienna, then the phrase captures something real. After Vienna and the wars that followed, there is no third siege of the Habsburg capital. There is no great new Ottoman push over the Danube that comes close to what Kara Mustafa attempted. The direction of pressure in that theatre is reversed. From then on, it is mostly the Habsburgs, and later the Russians who will advance at Ottoman expense, not the other way around. So when people say that an empire stretching from Algeria to Iraq was stopped forever by a Polish charge, they are compressing decades into a single striking moment. They are taking a long, uneven process. The failure before Vienna, the mobilization of the Holy League, the campaigns through Hungary, the signatures at Karlowitz, and anchoring it to an image that can be told in a single breath. Horses on a hillside, a king at their head, and an army that finally, unexpectedly, could not go any farther. Long after the dust settles on that hillside outside Vienna, the battle keeps happening in people's minds. Not the exact battle, of course. Not the heat and fear and confusion of the real day. What lives on is a version, shaped and reshaped, polished with each retelling until it fits what a community needs to believe about itself. In Ottoman chronicles, Vienna 1683 is a painful subject, but not always the catastrophe that later European writers imagined. Some accounts emphasize Kara Mustafa's mistakes, his delays, his refusal to launch the final assault when the city was weakest. They argue that it was poor judgment, not any fundamental weakness of the empire, that turned a promising siege into a rout. Others soften the blow by folding it into a familiar rhythm of fortune turning. Empires win some, lose some. God grants victory and takes it away. The empire has weathered defeats before and will recover again. The focus falls less on the Polish king on the ridge, more on internal reform, on how to strengthen discipline among janissaries, how to secure loyal provincial troops, how to keep the treasury filled. The humiliation stings, but it is absorbed into a longer Ottoman story of endurance. Across the lines in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, memory moves in a different direction. Here, Vienna becomes almost a crown jewel of national pride. Painters and poets linger on the moment of the charge, the white wings of hussars, Sobieski at the front, the letters he sends afterward, announcing in careful, almost understated language that the enemy camp has been taken, that Vienna is safe. In later centuries, when Poland loses its statehood, that memory grows even brighter. It is revisited whenever the present feels dark. Schoolchildren learn that their ancestors once rode to save an imperial capital that would, one day, rule over them. The story of Vienna becomes a reminder that Polish weakness in the 18th and 19th centuries was not inevitable, not the whole story. There were days when things were different. In Vienna and in the Habsburg lands more broadly, the battle settles into a comforting narrative. The city on the frontier, twice besieged, twice unbroken. The emperor's realm standing as a bulwark, the cross against the crescent, Christendom saved at the last hour. Statues go up, anniversaries are celebrated. The ridge where the Polish cavalry descended acquires a name, Kahlenberg, that echoes in sermons and patriotic speeches. Beyond the immediate participants, across Western Europe, the story stretches further still. It becomes a chapter in a larger imagined saga. The West stopping the East. Civilization turning back barbarism. Christianity halting Islam. The reality of diplomatic deals, trade agreements, religious minorities inside each empire, soldiers switching sides for pay, is far messier than that neat line. But the myth is powerful. It offers simple heroes and simple villains, which is exactly what myths are designed to do. Modern historians tend to move more slowly through the same ground. They count wagons and gunpowder barrels. They trace supply routes back to depots, note how many horses died on the march, how much disease spread in the trenches. They compare letters from commanders on both sides, look at weather patterns for that season, examine Ottoman and Habsburg tax records to understand how armies were actually raised and paid. From that angle, Vienna looks less like a clear moral drama and more like a precarious balancing act. A few decisions made differently, a breach pressed harder, or a storm ruining the relief army's gunpowder, a quarrel between allies delaying the march by a day. The outcome in this view is not written in the stars. It is contingent, fragile, the product of dozens of choices and accidents sitting on top of deeper structural trends. The myths are not useless. They tell you what people wanted to see in the battle. The more sober reconstructions tell you what probably happened. Between the two, you get something closer to a full picture. Not just the clash of faiths or civilizations, but also the grinding work of logistics, the jostling of court factions in Constantinople and Vienna, the way one failed siege could open the door to a redrawn map 16 years later at Karlowitz. If you think back to the opening image of this story, dawn over a camp, horses shifting, men tightening straps and saying quiet prayers, you can feel how thin the line really is between empire as it imagines itself and empire as it actually survives. One morning, you are the force that has pushed from Algeria to Iraq, that has taken Constantinople, that has twice set its gaze on Vienna. Another morning, you are standing on a slope, looking up at enemy banners on a ridge, and when the dust clears, the direction of history in that part of the world has tilted away from you. The soldiers who fought that day did not know they were standing at a hinge. They knew only the weight of their armour, the thirst in their mouths, the orders shouted over the noise. The echoes came later in songs, in paintings, in nationalist textbooks, in footnotes of careful monographs. One battle, even a famous one, does not decide everything. But sometimes it marks the moment when possibilities narrow, when certain futures slip quietly out of reach and others become more likely. Vienna 1683 is one of those moments. If you've listened this far, let your own memory of it settle. When you're ready to leave this field behind, I'd be grateful if you gently tap like and subscribe for more slow journeys through the past. And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. For now, let the noise of the charge fade. Let the campfires burn down to embers. Somewhere, another dawn is already gathering on another horizon, and another army is waking up, still unaware of how far its story will travel.